Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are focusing all our attention on a location that is, well, perhaps the pinnacle of ecological travel, the Galapagos Islands.
Absolutely.
I mean, this is a singular destination, isn't it? It sits right at the absolute top of nearly every serious traveler's bucket list, promising an encounter with wildlife unlike anywhere else on Earth.
It really is. It's where you stand, almost shoulder to shoulder with evolution itself. It's defined by this incredibly unique, approachable wildlife and these rigorously protected ecosystems. The whole experience, it's transformative. But as you know, that exclusivity comes at a pretty significant cost, both financially and logistically.
Exactly. And that's really the mission of this deep dive today. The Galapagos are, let's face it, notoriously expensive. And now there are new mandatory fees hitting the books for 2025. So maximizing value isn't just important, it's become critical.
Absolutely critical.
We've pulled together the essential facts from sources detailing these new 2025 costs. We've analyzed the real differences between cruising and land-based trips. And, maybe most importantly, decoded the seasonal timing puzzle.
Right. We want to give you, the listener, a sort of tactical blueprint. How can you unlock the maximum experience for your money? It's not just about, saving a few bucks here and there.
Well,
It's about strategically spending it to guarantee you get those wildlife interactions you're dreaming of without getting totally overwhelmed by the planning friction.
and our central finding, which honestly the sources really confirmed through some detailed comparisons, it's a bit counterintuitive. That perceived massive cost gap between, say, really bare-bones budget land trip and a small ship cruise, well, it might narrow significantly or maybe even disappear entirely once you factor in all the necessary day trips you need to reach those truly remote prime visitor sites.
Exactly. That's the key. We're going to show you the math, basically. Where do those initial savings actually get eaten up? Because understanding that fundamentally shapes your entire itinerary strategy.
Okay, let's unpack this complex logistical puzzle then. We're aiming to give you the comprehensive data you need to decide. Should you sail or should you stay put on land? And when should you actually book to make sure your travel aligns with specific animal behaviors?
Let's dive in.
Okay, so first things first,
Mhm.
we have to start with the money. It's unavoidable.
Yeah.
We need to set the expectation right now. The foundational truth is this experience is expensive. Our sources were really clear on this. They stress it again and again. This is not a budget destination.
Not at all. But, and this is important, they also affirm that for travelers who put wildlife first, who accept the high costs, and critically, who are prepared to follow the strict conservation rules, the return on investment is absolutely worth it. It's an unparalleled experience.
Preparation is key then. So to move past just vague ideas of expensive, let's look at the specific granular daily cost benchmarks that tour operators are providing for 2025. These categories really establish clear financial boundaries.
So starting at the top end for the organized trips, if you opt for a small ship cruise product, which is, pretty much always all-inclusive, covering your food, guiding, island transit, permits, all that, you should probably expect daily costs running somewhere near the $1,000 per person per day mark.
Wow. Okay, $1,000 a day.
Yeah. That's kind of the high-end benchmark for the most seamless experience, right? It's designed for maximum coverage of the islands and minimal effort on your part as the traveler.
Okay, what about the next step down? Maybe organized land tours.
So if you opt for mid-range organized land tours, these still include quite substantial activities, and guiding the average cost tends to settle around $800 per person per day.
Still significant, but a bit less.
A bit less. Now, it is true that budget DIY island hopping can start lower. Maybe you could get it down to, say, $400 a day. But that requires meticulous planning. Every single ferry, every day tour, every meal, every lodging booking. The planning friction is extremely high.
Right, you're really working for those savings. So if we think about a typical, maybe shorter trip, like a focused 5-day itinerary, what's the baseline total cost we're looking at, excluding the international flights, of course?
Yeah, excluding international airfare, you're likely looking at a baseline somewhere between $4,000 and $5,000 per person for that kind of common focused 5-day trip. And it's important to understand that price difference often relates directly to the level of access you get.
Access meaning how many remote islands?
Exactly, how many uninhabited islands you actually reach. So for a focused 5-day itinerary, the benchmark total outlay for a cruise generally sits around $5,000 per person.
Okay.
For organized land tours that try to pack in a similar kind of dense itinerary hitting those key sites, the benchmark is probably closer to $4,000 per person. And, we should absolutely note, luxury cruises, longer cruises, they soar far, far above these numbers.
Of course.
But the common thread, whether it's cruise or land, is that booking early, like 6 to 12 months out, is really critical for securing the best itineraries, especially if you have a specific goal, like, say, seeing the waved albatross. Those spots go fast.
Right. Okay, so regardless of whether you pay $4,000 or $5,000 for the core trip, there are these non-negotiable mandatory fees that every foreign adult has to budget for. And this is the critical 2025 update, isn't it? These fees have just seen a really dramatic increase.
This is the absolute must-know piece of information for planning now. You have to budget for these costs before you even look at your lodging or airfare. The major one is the Galápagos National Park entrance fee.
Okay.
This fee increased quite substantially to $200 per foreign adult. That became effective from August 2024 onward.
Wow, $200, that's double what it was before, right?
Exactly, it doubled. And obviously, that impacts the budget for any traveler or any group pretty significantly.
$200 just to step foot on the islands. When the sources discussed this huge jump, was there a clear reason given? I mean, travelers are going to want to know where that $200 is actually going.
That's a really important point. And yes, the sources did provide that context. It wasn't just an arbitrary increase. It's directly linked to the urgent need for expanded conservation funding.
Okay.
The sources detailed that this new revenue is specifically earmarked for several critical areas. Things like upgrading ecological infrastructure, think about new, more sustainable walkways or visitor centers. Also, funding crucial scientific monitoring programs, and maybe most importantly, increasing the resources dedicated to controlling and eradicating invasive species.
Which are a huge threat there.
They're the single biggest threat to that incredibly fragile native environment. So yes, it's a high cost, but it directly reinforces the conservation work that keeps the islands so unique in the first place.
That context definitely helps. Knowing the money is going straight towards protecting the ecosystem makes the expense feel, well, more justified. What's the other mandatory fee we need to know about?
That's the Transit Control Card, which you'll often see abbreviated as TCT. This one costs approximately $20 per person.
Okay, $20. Seemed minor compared to the park fee.
The cost is minor, yes, but the logistical process around getting it is crucial and, honestly, often overlooked until the very last minute, which can cause panic.
So walk us through that practical tip, because the sources really emphasize if you miss this step, your trip could be over before it even begins.
Absolutely. So the TCT, it's basically the official tracking mechanism. The Galápagos National Park uses it to monitor and control the number of visitors and how long they stay. You typically purchase this card at specific counters in the mainland airport, so either in Quito or Guayaquil, before you check in for your flight to the islands themselves, whether that's Baltra or San Cristobal.
Before check-in. Okay, that's key.
Crucial. You have to get this card, get the receipt stamped, and then you must keep both the receipt and your passport with you at all times when you're flying to, and also when you're flying from the islands. It's just a necessary piece of bureaucracy designed to protect the ecosystem.
So the takeaway is, don't arrive at the mainland airport 5 minutes before your flight to Baltra thinking you can just dash through.
Definitely not.
You need time to find the counter, queue up, pay the $20 for the TCT, then go check in for your flight.
Precisely.
Okay, so that adds up. $200 for the park, $20 for the TCT. That's $220 per person in absolute non-negotiable mandatory fees before you've even paid for one night of lodging, one meal, or one day of guiding. That demands careful budgeting right from the start.
Right at the top of your spreadsheet. Okay, so now that we've established that baseline cost, let's tackle the really central strategic decision. Do you sail on a small ship or do you stay on land and island hop? This choice, honestly, it defines your entire experience, it defines your budget outcome, and it really dictates the scope of the islands you can actually access.
Let's start with the small ship cruises. They command that higher per day price tag, we know that, around $1,000 a day.
Yeah.
But the argument for them really centers on unparalleled access and frictionless logistics, right?
Exactly. The cruise value proposition really boiled down to maximizing your reach to those remote visitor sites. The national park strictly regulates access everywhere. Cruises operate on these fixed, pre-approved itineraries that allow them to reach the more distant, often uninhabited islands, places like Española or Genovesa, Fernandina.
The really famous ones.
The iconic ones, yeah. Places that are generally too far or maybe too ecologically sensitive to reach via just a day trip from the main inhabited towns.
And the sources emphasize logistical efficiency. What does that efficiency actually look like in practice for the traveler on board?
Well, basically, it means reduced friction. Your small ship becomes your floating hotel, your restaurant, your transport hub, all rolled into one. You often wake up already anchored right off the next visitor site. All your guiding, your permits, the inter-island movement, the food, it's all bundled. This also usually includes reduced crowding because the park grants cruises these specific regulated landing windows. So often you're the only group on a particular trail at a specific time, which, hugely enhances the quality of the wildlife encounter.
Okay, but hang on. Even on a cruise, you're still in a very small boat for potentially several days, right?
Right.
Are the sources maybe overlooking the friction of, say, potential seasickness or just feeling a bit confined, especially during that choppier cool season we'll talk about later? I mean, that could significantly diminish the whole seamless experience for some people.
That's a really fair challenge to the idea of seamless. And yes, the sources do acknowledge that physical comfort or discomfort is a real variable. These ships are small, they will pitch and roll, especially in rougher seas. This is exactly why timing becomes so critical, as we'll definitely get into. A traveler who knows they're prone to seasickness really has to weigh that factor heavily and, frankly, invest in good medication, probably regardless of the season.
Yeah.
However, purely logistically, in terms of just getting you efficiently from point A, the wildlife site, to point B, the next wildlife site, the cruise generally remains superior in minimizing that transit time.
Okay, fair enough. Let's pivot then to the land-based value proposition.
Mhm.
The initial draw seems huge. Flexibility and crucially lower initial lodging costs.
Yes, absolutely. Land-based tricks offer significant initial savings because they allow you to leverage cheaper lodging, maybe stay in family-run hostels and use local, more affordable dining options in the main towns. We're talking about Puerto Ayora on Santa Cruz, Puerto Villamil on Isabela, and Puerto Bacarizo Moreno on San Cristobal.
And you control your schedule more.
Total flexibility over your daily schedule. Yeah.
Well, and this seems to be the big but. This is where our deep dive really confirms that central strategic insight we mentioned, the hidden cost of land-based trips. You might save, say, $200 a night on your hotel compared to the cruise price.
Right.
That saving is often completely illusory if your goal is to see the diverse wildlife that's spread out across the entire archipelago, not just near the towns.
Precisely. Those initial savings can erode dramatically the moment you decide, okay, I really want to see the key remote sites that truly define the Galapagos experience. Puerto Ayora is lovely, don't get me wrong, but the iconic blue-footed boobies of North Seymour, or those incredible volcanic formations on Bartolome, they're on uninhabited islands, and they are only accessible via regulated day tours.
And those day tours, presumably, are inherently expensive because they basically have to mimic the operational costs of a cruise guide, boat permit, fuel just shrunk down for a single day.
Exactly, they have high fixed costs.
So what are we looking at, ballpark, for the average cost of one of those full-day remote tours?
The costs do vary a little bit, depending on the specific site and the operator, but you should probably budget somewhere between $250 and $350 per person for a full day trip to an outer island like North Seymour or Bartolome.
Wow, okay. $250 to $350 per person. Their day trip.
Yeah, and that includes the required certified naturalist guide, the park permit fee for that site, the fuel for the fast boat needed to get you there and back, and usually lunch.
Okay, let's do the math really quickly just to make this totally concrete for listeners. Let's say you book a budget hotel for 5 nights in Puerto Ayora, and maybe you save, I don't know, $1,000 total compared to what a 5-day cruise might cost for lodging and food.
Okay.
But to see the must-see remote sites, let's say Bartolome, North Seymour, and maybe one other prime spot like South Plaza, you now have to purchase 3 of these day trips. Let's use the high end, $350 each.
Right. So 3-day trips at $350, that's $1,050 right there.
Your saving is gone. More than gone, actually.
Exactly. You've just exceeded your lodging savings, and you've added considerable logistical friction planning those tours, booking them, the early wake-ups.
Right.
This is the absolutely crucial finding from the sources. They show that land itineraries that successfully try to mimic the core highlights of a cruise itinerary, they quickly start approaching the pricing of a lower-end all-inclusive cruise. That total outlay gap, the difference in the final price, is often far, far smaller than many budget-conscious travelers initially anticipate.
And beyond just the money, there's the friction of the transit time itself. Can you maybe detail the difference in how a typical day might look on land versus on the cruise, specifically when accessing a remote site?
Yeah, definitely. Consider that land-based loop example. To get to a site like Bartolome from Puerto Ayora, you often need a mandatory early departure, maybe a 6 a.m. wake-up call.
Ugh.
Then you have transit, probably by bus or taxi, to the Baltra Canal ferry point, then a boat ride to the Baltra Pier. Then you board your day trip boat for maybe another hour or two.
Oh,
Then you have your site visit, then the long boat ride back, transit back to town. You can easily consume 10 to 12 hours of your day just in mandatory travel and transfers. And that can potentially include some very rough mandatory inter-island ferry crossings if you're trying to combine islands like Santa Cruz and Isabela.
and those ferries aren't exactly luxury liners, are they?
No, not at all. They're generally high-speed launches, basically. And as one source rather bluntly put it, they can be wet, bumpy, and require serious fortitude. Especially the crossing between Santa Cruz and Isabela, which is notorious.
Okay. Whereas on the cruise, how does that same trip to Bartolome look?
On the cruise, you likely wake up already anchored just off Bartolome. Maybe you have breakfast, and then around 8 a.m., you take a short ride in a specialized small boat, what the locals call a panga, directly to the landing site.
Panga.
Yeah, a panga is just a small motorized dinghy or inflatable boat. They're used for all the landings from the cruise ships and sometimes for shorter coastal explorations. It's part of the standard cruise setup.
So it saves hours of stressful travel time.
Hours, exactly. The cruise optimizes your actual contact time with the wildlife and the sights. The land-based option, especially once you start adding multiple remote day trips, tends to maximize your transit time instead.
Okay, let's quickly review those illustrative sample itineraries you mentioned, just to make this really tangible.
Sure, so for the compact cruise example, a typical 5-day, 4-night Central Islands loop is really designed for maximum efficiency. It might include, say, the Santa Cruz Highlands to see the giant tortoises,
A classic.
then Bartolome for that iconic Pinnacle Rock view, North Seymour for the amazing concentration of frigate birds and blue-footed boobies, and maybe Rabida Island for its unique red sand beach and great snorkeling. Because you're moving fast and hitting the ground running, the sources universally recommend booking those required buffer nights on the mainland Quito or Guayaquil both before and after,
Why the buffer nights?
just to ensure that any international flight delay doesn't cause you to miss your ship's departure. Cruise embarkation times are absolutely non-negotiable. Missing the boat is, well, a disaster.
And the corresponding land-based loop example for comparison, how does that look different?
The land-based approach shifts the logistics entirely onto you. You'd likely establish a base in Puerto Ayora on Santa Cruz. From there, you execute those expensive day trips we talked about to Bartolome and North Seymour. Then you probably commit maybe 2 nights over on Isabela Island, which requires relying on that potentially rough ferry transfer.
Yeah.
Specifically to access key Isabela sites like Los Tunales, famous for marine iguanas and penguins, and maybe Las Tintoreras for the resting white-tip reef sharks. Then you have to ferry back to Santa Cruz to eventually catch your flight home from Baltra Airport.
So you're constantly dealing with ferry schedules, transfers.
You're completely beholden to a rigid ferry schedule, and you have to factor in the comfort level or lack thereof of those often rough crossings.
It really does highlight the fundamental trade-off, doesn't it? You either pay the cruise premium for the seamless access and minimal friction, or you pay the accumulated day trip premium, accept the added physical friction of relying on the local inter-island transport network, and spend more time in transit.
That's the core decision right there. All right, moving on from the logistics and the money, let's talk about nature itself. The choice of when to go to the Galapagos is almost as critical as the choice of how to travel, because the animal behavior there is dictated almost entirely by the oceanographic conditions.
Okay, but the foundational rule here, the one the sources really hammered home, seems critical to state up front. There's absolutely no bad month to visit the Galapagos. Is that right?
That is absolutely correct. The wildlife is incredibly active year-round. This isn't like, the Serengeti where you have massive migrations happening only certain months. In Galapagos, something amazing is always happening.
Good to know.
But the type of activity shifts dramatically. The archipelago sits right at the confluence of several major ocean currents, and the resulting climate shifts are quite pronounced. These shifts, in turn, directly influence animal behavior, specifically things like breeding and feeding patterns. So your choice of when to go really depends entirely on matching your specific priorities. Maybe comfort, maybe seeing a certain biological event to the right season.
Okay, let's define the first main season then. Warm and calm. When exactly is this, and what's driving the conditions?
So this season generally runs from December through May, and it's primarily driven by the warmer waters coming down from the north, part of the Panamanian current system. The conditions during this time are pretty consistent. You get warmer air temperatures, critically, much calmer seas on average.
Ah, calmer seas. That's important for the cruise versus land debate, too.
Very important. And also easier, more comfortable swimming temperatures in the water. This usually translates to great snorkeling visibility as well because the warmer waters tend to be clearer, less filled with plankton.
Okay. And what are the animals typically doing during this warm palm season? What's the main viewing focus?
This period is really the prime time for vibrant terrestrial and land-based reproductive activity. The warmer weather and the clear water seem to trigger nesting cycles for many species. You'll likely witness a lot of courting behavior, nest building, and hatching.
Like what specifically?
Well, this is the peak season for sea turtles hauling out onto the beaches to lay their eggs. You'll see marine iguanas mating and nesting, often in large groups. And it's prime time for blue-footed boobies doing their famous sky-pointing courtship dance. The general energy on land feels very high, very focused on procreation.
Fascinating. Now let's shift gears completely to season 2. Cool, dry, and nutrient-rich. That sounds like a totally different environment.
It really is. This season runs roughly from June through November. And the conditions here are fundamentally driven by the influence of the cold water upwelling brought by the powerful Humboldt current coming up from the Antarctic.
The Humboldt current, okay.
Right. So the air is cooler and drier. This is often called the Garua season locally.
We should probably pause and clarify that term, garua. It sounds a bit mysterious. What does it actually mean for a traveler on the ground?
Yeah, Garua is just the local Spanish word for a specific type of persistent coastal mist or maybe a light drizzle. It's caused by the cold ocean currents hitting the warmer air masses around the islands. It often results in overcast skies, especially in the mornings, and definitely cooler surface temperatures, particularly in the highlands of the larger islands. It can feel quite misty and damp up there.
But this cooler air and water is actually the engine driving the ecosystem.
Exactly, because that cold Humboldt current carries something absolutely crucial with it: nutrients. Vast amounts of nutrients.
Okay.
So this cold, nutrient-rich water boosts oceanic productivity dramatically. Phytoplankton blooms, which feeds zooplankton, which feeds small fish. The whole marine food web just explodes.
Wow.
Yeah.
So while the seas might be choppier during this season,
They definitely can be, yes,
and the water's certainly colder, you'll absolutely want a wetsuit for snorkeling or diving.
for sure. Maybe even a thicker one.
The trade-off is potentially phenomenal marine action.
Phenomenal is the right word. This is the absolute best time for concentrated encounters with animals that feast on that abundance of plankton and small fish.
So we're talking about things like the Galapagos penguins, which thrive in that cold water.
Yes, penguin activity peaks during the season. You also see large pods of sea lions actively hunting and feeding, sometimes in big groups. And you can encounter huge schools of fish. The sheer biodiversity and density of life underwater during the cool season can be exceptional.
Okay, so the trade-off seems really clear then. Warm season generally favors comfort, calmer seas, clearer water for snorkeling, and seeing lots of land-based breeding activity.
Right.
Whereas the cool season favors potentially intense, dense marine life action penguins, feeding sea lions despite the chillier water and potentially rougher sea conditions.
That sums it up perfectly.
And the sources also stressed, didn't they, that you can't just generalize based on warm or cool. You really need to look at the specific wildlife calendar for the species you most want to see.
That is the ultimate level of nuance, yes. That's what separates the truly strategic traveler from the more generic tourist just hoping for the best. Let's take the waved albatross, for example, an absolutely magnificent bird, only nests on Hispaniola Island.
Incredible birds.
Truly. If seeing their spectacular mating dances and just their sheer presence on Hispaniola is a top priority for you, well, you must know that they are only present on the island from roughly April through December. They migrate completely away from the Galapagos for the rest of the year.
Wow, okay, so going in February means zero chance of seeing an albatross there.
Zero chance on Hispaniola. Similarly, maybe seeing the baby sea lions, little pups learning to swim is a big goal for you. The sources generally pinpoint October and November as the peak months for observing that specific behavior.
Got it.
So just a slight shift in your travel month, maybe by only 4 or 6 weeks, but guided by that biological calendar, can completely transform the entire focus and success of your trip, ensuring you see the specific events you traveled halfway around the world for. Okay, so we've covered the cost fundamentals and the critical importance of timing with the seasons and wildlife calendar. Let's wrap up with the practical, actionable toolkit that our sources provided, basically, the essential strategies for actually executing this high-cost, high-logistics trip as efficiently as possible.
Sounds good. Let's start with minimizing the overall financial commitment. We've talked about the cruise versus land debate, but beyond that, what concrete steps should listeners be taking when it comes to booking their air travel?
Right. Airfare is definitely a major variable cost. First, and this is standard advice but crucial here, book your flights to the Galapagos. That's either to Baltra, airport code GPS, or to San Cristobal, code SEY, as early as you possibly can. Fares tend only to go up.
Okay, book early. What else?
Secondly, and this is especially vital if you are meeting a fixed cruise itinerary, you absolutely must implement the buffer strategy.
Tell us more about this buffer strategy. What does that involve?
It means adding at least one buffer night on the mainland, so either in Quito or Guayaquil, both before your island's trip begins and after it ends.
Okay. Why is that so important?
Well, it's really a multi-benefit strategy. First, it often allows you to secure cheaper international airfares, which frequently involve less convenient connections or longer layovers. Booking flights that arrive the day before your cruise starts gives you that flexibility.
Makes sense.
But crucially, it provides a vital safety net against any international flight delays or cancellations. It ensures you absolutely do not miss your non-refundable cruise embarkation. As we said, missing the ship is probably the single most expensive mistake a Galapagos traveler can make. It's potentially thousands of dollars down the drain.
Right, that buffer day is insurance. Okay, what about for listeners who are leaning towards a cruise for the access, but maybe still trying to minimize that big total outlay? Is there a way to get the remote site access without paying the, $7,000 plus price tag for a full week's on cruise?
Yes, there is. You should look specifically for shorter, maybe 4 or 5 day cruise segments. These definitely exist, primarily focused on covering the central group of islands efficiently.
Okay.
Now, the per day cost will likely remain high, close to that $1,000 mark, because the fixed logistics costs, the ship, the crew, the permits are still there. But the total outlay drops dramatically compared to a 7 or 8 day cruise. So this approach preserves that fundamental cruise advantage, the seamless access to uninhabited sites, but for a lower overall price point.
Good tip. Now, flipping back to the committed land traveler. For someone who's decided to base themselves on an island but still wants to see those key remote sites, what tactical advice do the sources offer to help minimize the rising cost of those mandatory expensive day trips?
Okay, the land-based strategy definitely requires a mix of good organization and sometimes a bit of flexibility. First, try to cluster your day trips geographically if possible. For example, maybe try to book the Bartolomé Sullivan Bay tour one day and then the North Seymour Las Baixas tour the very next day.
Why cluster them?
It just minimizes your transit days back and forth to the docks, potentially saves a bit on transfers to the pier depending on the operator, and generally maximizes your blocks of time actually at the remote sites versus commuting.
Okay, makes sense.
Secondly, and this requires some serious flexibility and maybe isn't for everyone, you can look for last-minute deals on day tours.
Interesting. Where would you find those deals and what's the catch? Because there's always a catch, right?
There usually is. These deals are typically found by physically being in Puerto Ayora and booking locally, often during the shoulder seasons, think maybe late April, early May, or perhaps early September. Small tour operators might offer any unbooked spots on their high-demand tours at a significant discount, sometimes just a day or two before departure.
Okay, so you have to be there already.
You have to be there, and you have to be willing to maybe not get your first choice of site on your preferred day. The big risk is that you sacrifice guaranteed access to the absolute top-tier sites like Bartolomé or Española, as those spots often sell out weeks or months in advance. So this last-minute strategy is really only suitable for the traveler who is comfortable with that level of uncertainty.
Right. Not for someone who has their heart set on seeing Pinnacle Rock on Tuesday.
Exactly.
Okay, moving on to logistics. Once you are actually on the islands,
Yeah.
since you mentioned those potentially rough ferries again, let's revisit the critical warnings about payments and motion sickness.
Yes, absolutely vital. First, payments. You must bring cash. US dollars are the official currency in Ecuador, including the Galapagos. While the main towns like Puerto Ayora are increasingly accepting credit cards in hotels and larger restaurants, cash is still absolutely essential.
Essential for what specifically?
For paying smaller local tour operators, for tipping your guides and boat crews, which is customary, and definitely for paying for those inter-island speedboat ferries. Relying solely on plastic will seriously limit your flexibility and options, especially outside the main tourist hubs.
Good to know. Bring a decent amount of cash. And on the movement front, let's be really clear about the motion sickness warning. This seems particularly vital if you choose to travel during that choppier cool season, June to November.
Yeah, our sources were really quite insistent on this point. Those inter-island ferries, the lanchas, and even the smaller pangas used for cruise landings, they are not gentle pleasure cruises. The speed combined with the ocean swell, especially on that notorious crossing between Santa Cruz and Isabela, can be quite jarring.
Sounds rough.
It can be. So if you have any sensitivity to motion sickness, even mild, definitely pack prescription strength or at least high strength over-the-counter medication like Dramamine or Bonine. Consider patches or wristbands too. This is a really necessary piece of your preparation toolkit to ensure that physical discomfort doesn't completely ruin your wildlife viewing time. You don't want to be miserable on the boat when there are penguins nearby.
Very true. Okay, finally, let's cover the rules of engagement. This is a national park, and it's famous partly because its conservation efforts have been so successful. The strict regulations are there for a reason to protect this incredibly unique, but also incredibly fragile ecosystem.
And these rules are absolute. They are non-negotiable for every visitor. First, access to nearly all designated visitor sites requires you to be accompanied by a licensed naturalist guide certified by the national park. You generally cannot just hike or explore independently on these sensitive islands.
Okay, always with a guide. What else?
Second, group sizes are strictly limited, usually to a maximum of 16 people per guide, and you must stick to the march paths at all times. No wandering off. This prevents accidental damage to the fragile volcanic soil, the unique vegetation, and any unseen nesting sites.
Makes sense. And the most important behavioral rule, the one that really makes the Galapagos experience what it is, but maybe requires the most discipline from us as travelers.
Right. The absolutely crucial rule is maintaining the mandated distance from the wildlife, usually 2 meters or about 6 feet, even when the animals approach you. This is key. The animals here have virtually no innate fear of humans, which is, of course, one of the defining features of the Galapagos experience.
Yeah.
So a sea lion might genuinely just waddle up and nap on the path right next to you. A blue-footed booby might walk casually across your trail just a few feet away. Your job as the visitor is to remain passive, to respect their space, to back away slowly if they approach too closely, and above all, to follow your guide's instructions to the absolute letter.
It takes discipline not to reach out or get closer.
It really does. But this strict adherence to the distance rules is precisely what sustains the unique approachability of these animals for future generations. It's our responsibility as visitors to uphold that. Hashtag outro all.
Wow. Okay. This has been a really extensive deep dive, focusing specifically on how to unlock the value in what we know is a high cost, but also incredibly high reward destination. Let's try to synthesize the absolute essentials for everyone listening.
Sounds good.
First, those total mandatory fees, the new $200 national park fee plus the $20 TCT card, mean you're starting at $220 per person before anything else. That demands careful, upfront budgeting. But importantly, we know that money is going directly towards necessary conservation efforts.
Absolutely. And then we established that primary strategic trade-off. The cruise generally equals maximum wildlife reach across the archipelago and more frictionless travel experience, but it comes at a high daily premium, around $1,000 a day.
Right.
Versus land-based travel, which offers that initial financial flexibility and more control over your schedule. But those initial savings can quickly diminish or even vanish entirely once you start adding the necessary and expensive day tours required to reach the iconic remote sites. Plus, you take on considerably more travel friction yourself.
Yeah, understanding that specific tactical difference, the way those day tour costs add up, really moves you past being just a generic traveler planning a trip. You become more like a prepared naturalist, ready to make a strategic decision that's rooted in the science and logistics of the islands, not just a headline price tag.
Exactly. Which brings us perfectly to our final provocative thought for you, the learner, to maybe mull over. We spent a lot of time discussing those dramatic seasonal shifts, right? The warm, calm season from December to May, favoring all that land-based nesting and hatching driven by the warm Panamanian current, versus the cool, dry season from June to November, which drives that dense marine feeding action, the penguins, the sea lions hunting, all fueled by the nutrient-rich Humboldt Current upwelling.
Right. So the final thought is,
don't just pick your travel date based only on the lowest price you find, or maybe just when you can get time off work. Really contemplate how understanding the biological mechanism behind those seasons, the fundamental difference between a warm current triggering breeding cycles versus a cold current triggering feeding frenzies, how that understanding should shape your decision-making. Not just for Galapagos, but potentially for any major nature-focused trip you plan in the future.
so it's about connecting the why to the when.
Precisely. Recognizing the exact biological reason behind the seasonal variation helps ensure you get the specific, maybe once in a lifetime wildlife experience you're truly craving. It turns what could be just a generic booking into a much more informed, precision timed expedition. It elevates the whole process.
That's a great way to think about it. Move beyond tourist towards prepared naturalist. Okay, start budgeting that $220, figure out if you're a warm season or a cool season person, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.